and welcome to our speaker today, Laura Bates. Laura is the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, which I'm sure you all know and follow, and if you don't yet, will do. This is a web-based collection of over 60,000 women's daily experience of gender inequality. Laura is also an experienced journalist, writing for The Guardian, The Independent, and her work's appeared in the FT and the New Statesman. Today she is here to talk us through the project and also her fantastic new book, which was published this year, Everyday Sexism, which you will find lurking in our bookshop. I shall hand over to Laura, who'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have questions. So thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. Ooh, that's really loud. Thank you all so much for coming. I understand that some people are probably on lunch breaks, so if you need to go, if you need to get back to the office, please don't worry, I won't be offended. Just feel free to step out whenever you need to. Yes, I want to talk about the Everyday Sexism Project a bit, introduce you to it if you haven't heard about it, tell you a bit more about it if you have, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to have a good discussion. The Everyday Sexism Project was not something that I sat down and sort of planned. People quite often ask me now, you know, what made you think that you would do this? And when I started, I didn't think that this would happen at all. It was really something that kind of has grown out of a series of coincidences, really. And the first of those coincidences was just a really bad week where I was living in London and I was working at the time as an actress. And so I was kind of already aware that there were sort of things going on that I was beginning to pick up on more and more. When you're an actor, you get these casting breakdowns, and they basically tell you what the casting directors are looking for in a character when you're about to go up for a role. And my boyfriend was also an actor at the time, so he would get casting breakdowns for an audition, and it would say things like, you know, architect, 24, quite shy, has this kind of relationship with the people in his life, acts in this way when he's around others, this is his backstory that's kind of made him this way, this is the way he walks, all of these kind of details about who he was. And I would get casting breakdowns that literally sometimes just said 32 double D, and that would be it. Or sometimes they'd kind of go a bit further, but it was very specifically about looking at these women. It was always about looks or how sexy you were, and it was always through the male gaze. And sometimes they'd be quite kind of hilariously counterintuitive. So I once had one that said, she's sexy but virginal. She's a vixen but also naive. And it's just these kind of hilarious images that you get of these men sitting around a casting table kind of throwing out these completely unrealistic descriptions and then just saying, we'll just put them all in there. And I went to one audition where I'd worked really hard and I kind of learned the script and everything, and it was just for an advert. But when you're a struggling actor, you really want those auditions, because if you get a commercial, then you end up earning a lot of money in a short space of time. It kind of keeps you going through long periods of not having any work. And it was an advert for an IKEA wardrobe. And I got there and I was in the waiting room and I waited for about 20 minutes, during which time anyone could have come and talked to me, and no one did. And then just as I was about to walk into the audition room, someone just came up and put their hand on my shoulder and said, oh, by the way, we've decided to sex it up a bit and now you're taking your top off. Like, not will you or could you or can we discuss, but just this is what's happening. And it was really interesting, that complete confidence that this is the way things are, this is what you'll do as an actress, this is what, you know, we're using women for and the way that we're using them in this industry. And the thing was as well, in the back of my mind somewhere, I was like, for a wardrobe? Really? You know, like, no, it's not even, you know, we're going to talk about this scene that's really integral to the script. It was literally, we want to sell this wardrobe using your breasts. And at the same time, because I wasn't very good at acting, I was not getting many parts. I was nannying and kind of looking after children to make rent. And I started noticing that the children I was looking after, they were only 8 or 9, and the boys were kind of running around, playing football, reading, doing all kinds of stuff. And the girls were talking about thunder thighs, and they wouldn't eat the pasta that I made them one night because they'd heard somewhere that pasta makes you fat. And there were these really incredibly young, incredibly beautiful, natural, normal children, but dealing with all of these anxieties and worries and issues that the boys just weren't dealing with. So I was starting to think about these kinds of issues, and I felt a bit like I was seeing a kind of cause and effect from the auditions I was going to and then the things I was seeing in the kids I was looking after. And then I literally just had a really bad week where I was on my way home one night from nannying, and it was quite late at night, and it was one of those quite hot evenings where the traffic's kind of at a standstill and everyone's got their windows down. And someone just shouted at me out of a car window something about my legs, and then the next person in the next car thought it would be really funny to kind of do one up and talked about something a bit worse, and then there was some other guy shouting about what he wanted to do to me. And I just kind of shrugged it off and walked home and felt uncomfortable, kind of like you do. And then a few nights later, I was on the bus on the way home, and I was talking to my mum on the phone. It was quite late at night, and I thought the guy next to me just accidentally kind of brushed my leg with his hand and carried on talking to my mum. And then gradually, as the conversation continued, I suddenly realized this guy was really groping his way up my leg, up my thigh, putting his hand in my crotch. So I stood up and moved away from him, and because I was on the phone to my mum, I said what was happening in a way that I'm not sure I otherwise necessarily would have done in that situation. But, you know, when you're in that kind of bubble and you're talking to someone else, so I said, you know, I'm on the bus, this man's just groped me. And everyone on the bus heard me say it, and everyone looked out the window. Everybody looked away. And it wasn't even just that no one stepped in. It was worse than that. It was a real sense of like, why are you saying this? Why are you bringing this up in public? This is embarrassing. You should deal with it. It made me feel really embarrassed and really ashamed. It made me feel like maybe I'd done something wrong. It was my fault. And it really, really made me feel like maybe I shouldn't have been there. Maybe I was wearing the wrong thing. All of the kind of feelings of shame and embarrassment that the guy who did the groping should have been experiencing. And of course, what he got out of it was knowing that he could do that whenever he wanted, and even if the person he was doing it to said something, no one was going to react, and he could just carry on quite happily. And then a couple of days later, again, I was walking down the street, and there was this big truck, and some scaffolding was being unloaded off the back of it, and there were two guys working together. And as I walked past, within literally a metre of them, one of them turned to the other and just went, "Look at the tits on that." Not even her, just that. And it just suddenly hit me. I was just thinking about these three things that happened to occur within such a short space of time of each other. And when I thought about them, what really, really struck me was that if they hadn't all happened in the same week, I never would have thought twice about any one of them, because it was so normal. And I thought if any one of those things had happened on its own, I would have just shrugged, gone on, carried on home, like you do. And I started thinking of all the other situations when I'd done that, when something like that had happened, and I just got on with it, gone home, hadn't told anyone because I was used to it. And I started thinking, why am I used to it? This is crazy. Why am I so used to being insulted, to being kind of having sexual harassment shouted at me, all of these things? And I just couldn't believe how many there were that I added up on my fingers over the past months and years when I started thinking back to them. And in every case, I just ignored it, gone home, never told anyone, felt uncomfortable, got on with it. So I started to get a bit kind of obsessed with it, and I started asking other women, have you ever experienced anything like this? Women I knew, friends, people of my mum's generation, people that I just met. And I really thought that maybe, I don't know, 1 in 5 women would say, yeah, you know, I once had this thing happen, or, you know, I had a job once where there was this awful thing. And I thought that maybe I could put them together somewhere, like maybe I could write a series of articles or just something to kind of show the problem. And I was absolutely astounded by the response. It was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't like this one thing 5 years ago. It was literally, yeah, just now on my way to meet you, this happened. Yesterday, this happens. I spoke to friends who worked in the city, and one said that the guys in her office go to a strip club at lunchtime and sometimes take clients there, so she misses out on those deals, and then they come back and work with her in the office in the afternoon. Another friend said that sometimes when women are applying for new positions in her office, before they come in for the interview, her male colleagues will print out their pictures from the application form, hold them up across the office and rate them out of 10. It's like a kind of game. And the more these people kind of told me these stories, the more I realized this is so common, but just like me, so many of them said, wow, you know what, until you actually asked me, I've never told anyone about any of those things because it was just kind of normal. And the women in the offices, I said, like, surely there's something you can do, you know, can't you complain? Isn't there some kind of channel that you can go through? And she kind of went, yeah, there probably is, but it's normal, it's just the way things are. I just wouldn't have a long career at the company if I made a fuss. Everyone else puts up with it. I'd be the kind of odd one out. I'd be rocking the boat. So I started trying to speak up about this because I realized it was something that so many of us were having this experience and kind of thinking, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm unlucky, it's just the way things are, and not telling the story. And I found that again and again, when I did try and tell these stories, when I did try and talk about the problem, I was coming up against this really interesting response, which was, no, sexism doesn't exist anymore, women are equal now. And there was this really strong belief, we live in an equal society, you know, this real sense of kind of, you've got the vote, what more do you want? This kind of idea of women are equal now, you've got all the same opportunities as men, so, you know, if you're not reaching certain positions, it's because you're not interested or you're not doing as well, and sexism doesn't exist. And along with that went this idea that because we live in a society where sexism doesn't exist, if you're talking about sexism, you're making a fuss about nothing. You're whining, you're overreacting, you're getting your knickers in a twist, maybe you're a bit frigid, maybe you took it the wrong way, you need to get a sense of humour, learn to take a compliment, all of these things that I heard again and again and again. And I thought, you know, maybe they're right, this was all very new to me. I did kind of feel like we were living in a relatively equal society, and I thought I'd look into it and see if it was true that everything was equal and there was nothing to worry about. And, and here are just a few of the things that I found when I started looking into it. I found that in the world, only 1 in 5 people in Parliament is a woman, that the UK comes joint 57th in the world for political gender equality. I found that 1/5 of the membership of our House of Lords is women, and just under a quarter of our members of the House of Commons. And that in the UK cabinet at the time, just 23 cabinet ministers are women, but that soon dropped. Out of 23, just 4 were women, but that soon dropped to 3. And then I looked into the law, because I thought, you know, that's another area where it's not just about gender representation, it's also about the fact that those people in those areas are making decisions affecting our day-to-day lives, so it's kind of a double impact. And I thought the law was another area like that. And I was really quite shocked to find that only 4 out of 35 law justices of appeal and 18 out of 108 High Court judges are female. And then I looked into the arts, because I thought people are going to say to me, oh, you know, politics and law are male-dominated, but there are female-dominated areas as well, and it all evens itself out, and you can't account for choice and all of these kind of excuses. So I thought, you know, what's an area that people would say was probably really female-dominated? The arts. I think a lot of people would think that it was. And I found that in our National Gallery, it was reported in 2010 that out of 2,300 works, the collection has paintings by just 10 women. That at our Royal Opera House, it's been over 13 years since a female choreographer was commissioned to create a piece for the main stage. And that out of 573 statues around the UK commemorating people of interest and admiration, only 15% of them are of women. And this happened everywhere I looked, in every field. I found that fewer than 1 in 10 of our engineers is female, which is less than half the proportion of France or Spain. That the Royal Society, one of our most prestigious scientific institutions, has never had a female president, and only 6% of the current fellowship are women. That 50% of chemistry undergraduates are women, but only 6% of professors. And then I looked into the media. It was everywhere I looked. Women only write 1/5 of front-page newspaper articles, but 84% of those articles are about male subjects or experts. Women directed just 5% of the 250 major films of 2011, and although only 1 in 5 UK architects is female, 63% of them report experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace in the course of their career. And then this was kind of the thing that really struck the final nail in the coffin for me. It was looking at these statistics. I found that in the UK, there's a phone call to the police every minute about domestic violence. Roughly every 6 to 7 minutes, a woman is raped, adding up to over 85,000 women, that's actually wrong, raped per year, and 400,000 sexually assaulted. That 1 in 5 women in the UK is the victim of a sexual offence from the age of 16 onwards, and that a woman living in the UK has a 1 in 4 chance of being a victim of domestic violence. And of course that worldwide 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. So I felt that this argument that I shouldn't make a fuss and I shouldn't be talking about it because women are basically equal now, more or less, didn't really stand up to scrutiny. But I also recognised that it wasn't going to be successful to keep talking about a problem if people refused to recognise that the problem existed. That we couldn't start to tackle something if there was this widespread belief that it wasn't even there, it wasn't even an issue. And I felt like what I wanted people to have was that experience I'd had of hearing all those women's voices and stories together in one place and going, wow, when you hear all this together, it just builds up this picture. And it's not just that you start to realise how many they are, it's also that you start to realise how bad they are, how much worse than the odd wolf whistle here or there that so many people think we mean when we talk about sexism, but also how connected they are. Because one of the things that started to become really, really clear was that there were such close connections between the different things being reported, such crossover between the different areas. And so I started a really simple website where I asked people to add their experiences of any kind of gender inequality. And I thought that way probably was the simplest way of giving other people that same experience I'd had, of looking at all this stuff in one place and realizing what was going on. And I didn't have any kind of funding, so I didn't have any way of publicizing the website or telling people about it. And I thought that maybe 60 or 70 people would end up adding their stories. But instead, it was like when I was in a room and I talked about the project, one woman would come forward and tell her story, and then it would trigger someone else and someone else and someone else. And so many of these stories had never been told, or if they tried to tell them, they'd been belittled and brushed off. And so there was this kind of domino effect. There was this kind of relief at being heard. And I think all I can think is that what happened online very much mirrored that. So someone must have posted their story, and then they mentioned that they'd done it. They talked about it on Facebook. They put it on their Facebook wall. And then for every person that saw that and went and read the stories, they were triggered to remember more and more. We hear so often from women who say, I came to your website thinking, no, I've never experienced sexism, but I was curious. And then the more of the stories I read, the more I went, oh yeah, well that's happened to me. Oh yeah, actually that's happened to me. And that there's such a sense of kind of burying things and normalizing things even within our own minds. And so things started to kind of take off a little bit more than I expected. And suddenly the project was being sort of picked up and quoted and described in different news outlets around the world. And we started hearing from women all over the world, from women of all different backgrounds, all different ages, disabled and non-disabled. And we started hearing from a woman who worked as a cashier in a video store, who said that every time that she went up the ladder to get fresh stock from the storeroom, her boss would smack her on the bum. And when she came back down, he'd just look down her top and say, you know why I hired you. We heard from a woman working in the city who was told to sit on her boss's lap if she wanted her Christmas bonus. From a woman who worked in an x-ray department in a hospital who asked for a consultant's help in interpreting an x-ray and was told to sit on his lap if she wanted his help. We heard from a vicar in the Church of England who said that she was constantly being asked if there was a man available to perform the wedding or the funeral, and always that it was nothing personal. We heard from a female vet who was not allowed to touch certain racehorses because they were considered to be so special and so purebred that the owner only wanted a male vet to look at them. We heard from a female DJ who talked about how her job was everything to her. She loved it. She'd been so passionate about it. But when she went to work, she got so many guys coming up and asking her where her boyfriend was, thinking that she was just standing there by the decks while he'd gone to the loo. So many guys that would grope her and grab her and physically sexually assault her while she was trying to do it, that she'd come to dread the job that she'd once loved. We heard from a midwife who was regularly sexually assaulted by a senior male colleague. We heard again and again and again from schoolgirls who said that they were being shouted at and worse, being groped and touched in their school uniform on their journey to school. And then gradually, as the stories started to get spread around the world, as people started picking this up in the press, we started hearing from women in different countries too. And very, very, very quickly, stories started flooding in that were more global. So we had an email from a woman in Pakistan who talked about hiding sexual abuse for the sake of family honor. From a woman in Germany who said that her crotch and her bottom were groped so frequently she just described it as the norm. A woman in Mexico who was a student, and she was told in her university lecture in front of all the other students by her professor, "Calladita te ves más bonita," you look prettier when you shut up. 12 and 16-year-old girls in France who tried to picnic in a public park only for a man to come and expose himself to them. A woman in Argentina who was trying to just walk down the street and ignored the 4 men wolf whistling at her from their car only to find that they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her in. And a woman in India who was too afraid to report the man with the erect penis pressed into her back on the train. So we very quickly were able to expand into these different countries around the world and start collecting stories from all these different places, and very much with local ownership. So what would happen was that we would invariably get an email from someone saying, I'm from X country and we really need this here. And then we would give them the tools to launch it there, and they would be kind of in control of what was done with it. So for example, the women who run the Danish branch of the project have recently been using the stories in the local press to raise awareness of the issue, and they've been actually meeting with politicians in the same kind of way that the project's developed here. And one of the things that was really interesting about this was that idea of connections coming through between the stories. So the first thing was that we would hear the same words and phrases that were being used, say, to a woman who was being verbally harassed in the street, who had been told, it's no big deal, it's just a catcall, ignore it. And that same exact word and phrase was used later to a woman who was actually being sexually assaulted. Or we'd see how situations would escalate. So a woman would try to brush off or ignore or reject verbal harassment, only to find that immediately, hey baby, hey sexy, turned into, who the fuck do you think you are, bitch, to reject me? And that often it would then escalate into pursuit or even sexual assault in some cases. We heard how kind of, for example, the sexism in the media that some people were reporting would kind of seep over into other areas. So, for example, we had 15-year-old girls who talked about how the boys at school would hold up page 3 and rate them out of 10 next to page 3, comparing them to the models. We heard from a woman who had page 3 mentioned by her rapist when she was being raped. So we started seeing these kind of really close connections that were going on, and people started reporting things that weren't necessarily personal experiences, but also kind of wider sexist issues and instances of sexism. So people started reporting the way that women are portrayed in the media and the way that that made them feel. We had a 16-year-old girl who said, I know I'm clever, I know I'm intelligent, everyone keeps telling me I could do whatever I want, I can be whatever I want to be, but I just don't feel like it matters unless I'm sexy. I look at the world around me and I see that when a woman is successful, she's only successful really if she's sexy and successful. I worry constantly about my breasts and whether they'll be big enough, about my waist and whether it will be small enough. I know that everyone tells us that beauty's on the inside, but it just doesn't feel that way. We heard from people talking about the way that it made them feel that they didn't see themselves represented in the media. The fact that we see so many women's bodies and so much of women's bodies in the media, but very, very specifically just one particular type of women's body. That really all we're seeing is this one particular young, blonde, white, thin, long-legged, large-breasted person again and again and again. But also about the messages that women were receiving from the media about the things that they should be interested in, and the things that they should be worrying about, and the impact that that was having as well, especially on young women. The way that women were seeing pieces of their bodies, pieces of women's bodies being used in a completely unrelated way to sell products, in a really dehumanizing way, often just a kind of headless body being used to sell a PlayStation video, for example, whether it was selling a burger or a betting website. And sometimes these things, if you saw it on the side of a bus, you're so used to it. It's so much about this normalization, the stuff that we're so used to that we don't really stop and think about it. And then when you do look at that advert and you stop and think about it, it's kind of quite extraordinary. And then they started talking about the way that they saw women in the public eye being treated, and the way that no matter why a woman was in the public eye, she was always treated as a sex object first and foremost. It was always about either how good she looked or whether men would want to sleep with her, regardless of the reason why we were talking about her. Whether she was somebody who had been convicted or accused of a murder, as in the case of these women. That's a segment on the TV show The Right Stuff, Foxy Noxy, would ya? Whether it was someone who had been the victim of a crime. This was the headline that The Sun ran on its front page the day after Reva Steenkamp had been murdered, allegedly by her partner. It didn't even have her name. Or whether they were a politician. Whatever it was, if a woman was in the media, it was first and foremost about whether or not she was sexy. And then you look at the kind of knock-on impact that this has on the way that women are perceived. So, for example, a really good example is the recent Conservative Party conference, where the front page of The Guardian the next day had a big article about Cameron and Osborne and the policies that they talked about and the kind of promises that they'd made at the conference. And then the whole of the top of the paper was just taken up with a massive picture of Theresa May's shoes and a comment about what her shoes were like. And the fact that that's trickling down into voters' kind of ideas about people and about who they might want to vote for and why. And then there was another reaction as well that I hadn't really anticipated, which I don't know if you can read those. Oh yeah, that's quite clear. So this is what happened the first time that I went on the radio to talk about the project and to talk about these kinds of issues. This is what happened the first time I gave a speech about politics. My favorite thing about this one is that I'm not sexist or anything. And these were what happened pretty much within the first 2 weeks of starting the project. And the interesting thing about these messages is that they started coming in before the project was high profile. So before there was any media attention, before people really knew about it, before anyone was talking about it, the rape threats and the death threats had already started. It was already so threatening and scary to have the idea of a woman talking about women's issues, talking about sexism, talking about equality. And these messages would come in at a rate of about 200 messages a day. They would be quite coordinated, so you'd get kind of streams of them, and then it would stop for a few hours, and you would kind of breathe a huge sigh of relief. And then they would start coming back in, saying, oh, hey again, Laura, did you think we'd forgotten you? They're really psychological, stuff about what time people were planning to do things to you. Not just, I will rape you, but these are the 7 weapons I'll use on you and in what order. Threats about raping members of my family, stuff about what time they were planning to come and attack you, stuff about how they could track you down using your IP address to find you, to work out where you lived. Just incredibly, incredibly specific stuff, and stuff that was very carefully calculated, I think, to have a real psychological impact. So there'd be messages about snipers, and no matter how much you sit down rationally and say, that is someone trying to scare me, I know it's someone trying to scare me, I know it's not real, I really challenge anyone not to just glance at high buildings as they walk around for the next couple of days. It just gets inside your head. And when you've read through those things and then you go to bed, those images play in your head. And that's really interesting because there's been a lot of stuff in the news about this recently, and there's a really common reaction I hear a lot, particularly from kind of older men commenting on this, who kind of say, well, can't you just turn off the internet? You know, why do you have to do it? Why do you have to be on Twitter? You know it's not real. You know they're not really doing it. And there's a massive gulf between what we all know kind of in the daytime when we're being sensible and the part of your brain that thinks there's an alien outside when you hear a noise at night. And of course, if you've had these kinds of messages, when you hear the noise at night, this is the stuff that you think about. Not to mention that part of you that is thinking, well, what about that 0.01% chance? And the other thing that's really interesting about it is that when you say, why don't you just go off Twitter, why don't you just turn off Facebook, why don't you just not write your blog or whatever it is, what you're really saying to women and to young women who experience this in particular, who are just using those spaces to express themselves politically, is, you know, let these people win. If people threaten you and are sexually abusive towards you, then the best thing to do is just to retreat from those spaces because they're not yours. And it's so interesting because you hear a lot of talk about freedom of speech in these cases, which of course doesn't apply. If someone's saying that they'll rape you or kill you, it's irrelevant anyway. But even if it does, even if it's something slightly more minor than that, why isn't anyone talking about the freedom of speech of the women who aren't being able to use their voices in those spaces? And the really interesting thing, I think, about these messages is that they seem to kind of take the assumption that it was all about attacking men, that the project was about privileging women over men, that it was somehow about suggesting that all men are bad and sexist and attacking them. And right from the beginning, it had been a really big point that the project was never about vilifying men. It was never about this idea of men versus women, of setting men up against women. And in fact, it became so clear from really early on, from the entries we were getting, how badly men were being affected by sexism as well. So firstly, we'd have messages that came in from men. We'd have men sharing their experiences. And we had one guy who wrote in, and he'd asked to take parental leave from work. He wanted to share the care of his newborn daughter. And he hadn't just been denied it, but he'd also been really ridiculed and kind of bullied in the office for asking for it. And the really interesting thing was that just a week before we got that message, we got a message from 2 women who worked together, and they said they'd just been turned down for a job because they were considered a pregnancy risk. And quite clearly, that's not 2 people experiencing different issues, men over here and women over here. It's 2 sets of people both experiencing the negative consequences of the same kind of outdated sexist stereotype. So we've made it really clear from the very beginning that, you know, this was about everybody together. This was about people standing up against prejudice. This was very much not about men against women. And yet, the idea of it, just the idea of talking about it, was so scary to some people that this was the only way that they could think of to react and to try and kind of shut things down. And those connections that we saw between what men were experiencing and what women were experiencing were also mirrored in another pattern of connections which started to come out from the entries we were receiving, which is that we were getting entries from women who were experiencing sexism intersecting with other kinds of prejudice. So, for example, we heard from an Asian woman who was walking down the street with her boyfriend, and people would shout at him saying, "Is she a mail order bride?" We heard from a black woman who worked behind the bar who said that although the white women who worked with her were harassed, she was constantly asked to twerk. She was called spicy and exotic. We heard from a disabled woman who was in her wheelchair when two men shouted her in the street, if you're going to just sit there, you might as well at least get your tits out. We heard from another disabled woman who walked with a cane who was asked if she could do a pole dance around it. We heard from trans women who were regularly experiencing extreme harassment in the street, not just because they were women, but because they were trans. We heard from gay women who were out with their partners and had people coming up to them saying that they could turn them straight, men coming up to them asking if they could join in, asking if they could watch. We heard from older women who again and again and again use the same word in their project entries. And this is a really interesting thing that happens every now and then. The same word or phrase will be used again and again and again. And in the case of women over the age of about 40, thousands of them wrote in using the word invisible. Again and again and again, they said that society made them feel invisible. One woman even wrote in saying, "Don't you ever wonder why you see so many of us women in our 60s and older wearing red and purple coats? It's because we're afraid that people will walk into us." And so something that became really clear from these entries was that sexism wasn't just happening in a vacuum. It was something that was intersecting with and combining with other forms of discrimination. And that was a particularly important thing to come out of the project because it had something to say for the way that we tackle sexism and the way that we were trying to combat it, that there wasn't very much point trying to combat it on its own if we weren't also looking at other forms of oppression and discrimination that were also occurring with it and trying to find a way of tackling it that kind of took into account all of those different paradigms as well. There's a trigger warning for the next slides because there's some quite unpleasant images that might be triggering in the kind of realm of sexual violence and domestic violence, so just to let you know if anyone wants to look away. Oh, actually, well, this one kind of is as well. So the other kind of area that really came up out of the project was that the internet was kind of a bit of a wild west where some of these things were being particularly magnified and particularly coming up and becoming clear. And a lot of this kind of particularly seemed to focus on young women and students, particularly around websites like the Lad Bible, UniLad, spotted websites, Confessions of a Uni Student. And these are websites which are generally about pursuing female students. They encourage the pursuit of female students like prey. There was a recent article on one of them around Freshers Week which talked about the idea of trying to get around the consent of a female student who said that she doesn't want to sleep with you. And they described her as an obstacle course. It's all about kind of casting the idea of kind of pursuing someone to the point of sexual assault as if it's just a big joke, as if it's a bit of a game, and as if you somehow win lad points if you manage to achieve it. And it's not just about getting laid, it's also about humiliation. It's about, can you get the girl out of bed the next morning without finding out her name? It's all about, specifically about degrading women, about doing them down. And it's really fascinating that although a lot of these websites are very much about female students, thousands of articles about women, you won't see a single woman's name on the website because the names are replaced with words like wenches and hoes and clunge, skank, sloppy seconds, milf, bird, chick, tramp, gash, because they're often used just a number out of 10 to describe women. So, for example, last night I was banging a solid 6 out of 10 and this or that happened. And it all comes back to this kind of idea of dehumanization, essentially, and telling boys, and particularly young men, don't think of these women who are your peers as human beings. Think of them as prey, think of them as objects. And particularly this kind of thing was proliferating at the time on Facebook. And so images like this, images which weren't just sort of joking about domestic violence and rape, but in some cases were actually condoning or encouraging it. And these are kind of images that were being circulated to the extent that they'd have hundreds and thousands of likes. They'd be shared. As soon as somebody liked or shared it, it could pop up in the newsfeed of any of the thousands of people that they were friends with. And there was a real sense of kind of normalization going on and a sense of this idea of banter. And that's something that seems to be quite a new thing and quite a really problematic thing, particularly amongst young people at the moment, that again and again we get stuff reported to us and girls, even if they've been sexually assaulted, even if they've been raped, would say, but I don't think I can say anything about it because it's just banter. Or they'll say that it was just banter. And there's this idea of this kind of cloak of irony or humor being used to excuse things to such an extent that nothing can be criticized anymore because it's just a joke, because it's just banter. And the problem with this kind of attitude, the problem with these kinds of blurring of the boundaries between victims and abusers is that they start to seep over into our ideas about what's normal. And so we also started getting stories about kind of really, really widespread, deep problems in the way that we talk about rape, the way we talk about sexual assault, the way we talk about sexism, and how connected that is. The idea that somebody experiences an assault and the first thing that's asked is, what were you wearing? Or where were you? Or why had you been drinking? Or had you been leading him on? And the kind of knock-on effect of this is that I started going into universities and doing lots of talks and working with schools. And one of the things that I talked about a lot was the UK definition of sexual assault, because we had so many entries coming in from young girls, from girls at uni, saying that they'd gone out clubbing or they'd gone out somewhere and they'd been grabbed. They'd had somebody put their hand between their legs. They'd had someone grab their breasts when they were out for a run. They'd had someone grab their bum when they were in the queue at the bar. And there was absolutely no connection between what they'd experienced and this. So I go into universities and I just put this up and say, like, okay, this is the UK definition of sexual assault. Somebody touches you, the touching is sexual. The person touched doesn't consent to the touching, and the person doing it doesn't have reasonable belief that they did consent. And importantly, it doesn't specify where on your body this happens. So then I'd say, so if someone grabs your breast, if someone puts their hand between your legs, it's a form of sexual assault under UK law, which carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. And afterwards, young women would come up to me and say, well, that can't be right. That can't be sexual assault because it's normal. It can't be sexual assault because it's just what happens when we go out with our friends. Can't be sexual assault because we wouldn't feel able to call it that. There's no way we would go to the police when this happened to us because we'd be derided. What are you talking about? What are you making a fuss about? It's just banter. It's just a joke. And so I realized that we were kind of dealing with a situation where people were being conditioned, and young women particularly were growing up in a society which told them to expect and accept things which actually they're protected from by law. And the same was obviously true with a lot of the different entries that we were getting. So we had a huge number of entries coming in from women in the workplace who were being harassed, who were being discriminated against, who were being groped. And very much there was this sense of, I can't rock the boat, I shouldn't make a fuss, I might lose my job. And absolutely no awareness of the fact that the law protected them from any of these things. So there's kind of a gulf in awareness between what the situation is and legally what the situation should be. And ironically, I think that's part of why we have this problem with people saying, but everything's fine now, women are equal. Because actually, in terms of policy and legislation, we have won a lot of battles. We have come a long way, but what's happening on the ground is very different. And those kind of wins aren't actually trickling down to have a big impact in reality. I haven't got a watch on me, but I think probably that's a good place to pause and take some questions, yeah. Yes? Well, the thing that I think is the biggest problem at the moment, did everyone hear the question? If I could change one thing about maternity and paternity legislation, what would it be? If you'd asked me a while back, I would have said shared parental leave, but luckily and happily that is coming in from April next year. The big problem that I think at the moment, as in terms of a specific legislation issue, is that they've recently brought in tribunal fees. So if a woman's experiencing maternity discrimination and she wants to take her employer to a tribunal, it used to be free until very recently, but the government's recently changed it to cost £1,200. And in the time since they've done that, the number of cases being brought has absolutely dropped by about 80%, which is not because they've stopped happening. I think that a lot of people don't recognise how bad maternity discrimination is. The latest figures suggest that 50,000 women a year in the UK lose their jobs because of maternity discrimination, i.e. not that number of women get pregnant and choose to take time off, that number of women are actively fired because they are pregnant and for no other reason, which is kind of really quite shocking. And there was a poll in The Guardian actually just this week as well that showed 500 managers and employers were asked about their attitudes towards employees, and 40% of them said they'd avoid hiring women of maternity age just to get around the problem of maternity leave altogether. So I think it's a massive issue. And the other thing I think is about increasing awareness among women of what their rights are, because we just hear from so many people who are so scared in that situation. What happens in the workplace is that people are there's this added pressure of being seen as a troublemaker, losing your job, being kind of considered a bad person. And so we see very few people kind of being able to access any kind of legal support at all.
So sitting here is one of very few
I don't know. As you say, we just don't have the data to suggest it. What I really would say is that we're not trying to suggest for one moment that we think this is something all men are guilty of. I think, and I very much hope, that it's a kind of small minority. And one thing that has been really encouraging has been the number of men who've stood up alongside us, the number of men who've supported the project, the number of men who've written in actually and said ways that they found in their own lives of taking action. We heard from a guy who was a big football fan who said that he wrote to the manager of the football club because he realised that a lot of the chants that they were singing were spectacularly misogynistic. Another guy who said that he was looking at the website and he was reading about women's experiences of catcalling, and he'd never really thought about it from their perspective before. But after realising how bad it was, he saw another man shouting at two women in the street, and he just ran after him and tapped him on the shoulder and just stopped him and said, "Can I just ask you, why did you do that?" And that the other guy just looked at him and had no idea what to say. Another guy who was walking past a building site when two builders shouted, "Get your tits out," and he just lifted his t-shirt up and showed them his and kind of just sent that message of solidarity to the women who were being shouted at, but also a message to the men. Not all men are like this. So that's really encouraging. Yes?
What I want to say is that I'm so saddened to hear about all the stuff that you said, and you said it very eloquently and fluently, but I cannot understand how you do not hold men responsible for this. I just cannot understand it. Men have been doing this as long as I've lived, which is 68 years, and a hell of a lot longer before that. And I do not understand, and I feel very angry that women are not holding men responsible. When you talk about the men that have contacted you and said, "This has happened to me, this has happened to me," I'm sure it has, but they are so minimal compared to the number of women that are telling you about what's happened to them. It's men who are responsible for all of this. It's men who perpetrated, and it's men who have got to be held responsible for it. And we as women have got to hold them responsible for it. And we as individuals, and we as women in general, have got to hold men responsible for it. They have got to do something about it. And if there are men around who do not behave like this, then they have got to make sure that other men don't. It's their responsibility. Like it's our responsibility to ensure that racism does not continue and perpetuate if we are not women or people of colour. And when we see what has happened with minority ethnic groups and what has happened to black people and other people of colour, then we must do this in terms of ourselves as women, and men must do this and take responsibility. Sorry, I'm feeling so angry and agitated about what I've heard, and I'm really sorry, Laura, but I have to say to you, I feel that it's wrong that you are not saying that men are responsible for this, because they are. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. When I say that I'm not holding all, what I really want to draw a distinction, which is that I don't think it's fair to hold all men responsible for the specific actions of some. I agree with you absolutely that we need to call on all men to make the change, but I'm not saying we shouldn't hold those men who do act like this responsible. Absolutely. Every one of those threats has been reported to the police. It's against the law. I've gone after those men. I know, you don't have to tell me. I agree with you. I'm out here trying to talk about it and get people to realise how bad it is as well.
All men, okay, maybe not every single man in the world, but the vast majority, they are sexist and they do behave like that. They do. Otherwise you would not be getting this amount of comments from women, which is just a tiny amount.
I agree with you. I know it's horrific and we absolutely have to take action. One of the things that we've been doing specifically to try and prosecute the men responsible is working with the British Transport Police to increase prosecution. We took 2,000 of the stories that we had from women on public transport who hadn't reported it. So like you say, people kind of getting off the hook, not being held responsible, took them to the British Transport Police, broke them down into different kind of areas, explained to them what was going on, and then went back and told women, you have to report this when it happens. Did a massive social media campaign, told them the police will be taking it seriously. And so far it's raised reporting of sexual offences on public transport by 32%. Well, it's important to, be aware of your own needs and self-care. I think when you do feel able to challenge it, it is important. And if you can challenge as many of those instances as you possibly can, I do think it's really important. I think in a lot of cases, so much of this is so normalized that often these are things that people do and say without even thinking about it. It's something that just is so normal, so much a part of life, and that actually that experience of someone challenging them can have a massive impact on someone's future actions in a lot of different ways. Either if it's someone who's just never considered it, and by you telling them will be really quite shocked and ashamed and will change their behaviour, or in other cases, if it's kind of a more severe case like that case on the bus, if one person even, I think, had stood up to that guy on the bus that night and said, "What do you think you're doing? You can't touch that girl," then I think that we react very strongly to those things. None of us likes to be told off in public. There's that sense of embarrassment. All of those feelings of shame that I felt would have been transferred onto him, and he would have thought twice before doing it again. So I think there really is something to be said for standing up, for speaking out, for making it clear. But I'd also really encourage you and everybody to feel able to report things when they happen, whether it's reporting something to a superior, whether it's something that happens in the workplace. If you're in the street and somebody shouts at you from a van or on a construction site, if you experience any kind of sexual harassment, report it to that company. And we've had so many people say that they've done that and that it's been really successful, that the company has taken it really seriously. And then what happens is that the men in that case are getting the message from their superiors at work, this isn't acceptable. It becomes something that threatens their job, rather than just a girl in the street kind of shouting back at them, which they might be more sort of likely to laugh off. So there are lots of different ways of kind of being able to take action and hopefully to change things. But also I think the really big thing is about supporting other women when they're standing up, because it's so easy to isolate someone when they try and call this stuff out. And I think that's been a very successful silencing mechanism of feminists for a long time. Oh, she's ugly, oh, she doesn't get the joke, or she's overreacting, she's uptight, she's a prude, she's jealous, whatever it is. And actually that doesn't work. That power of that falls away if 10 other people stand up as well and say, actually, sorry, no, this is a real problem and we need to deal with it. And the same is true in the workplace, I think, where people are so scared to come forward and report something because of that attitude of it's normal, everyone else puts up with it, I'll be seen as a troublemaker. But if 5 women all working in the same office go to the boss together and say, we need to address this issue, it's much more of a kind of group thing, and it's much less sort of a feeling of personal risk. So I think that's another really good way to kind of tackle things positively as well.
But what about things, for me, it's not like big things, like nothing massive has ever happened to me. It's just these continual small comments, like, that are so obviously sexist, but I don't know, like, you can't, it's not, like I said to my boss the other day, he's male, I had a fight with my boyfriend, blah, 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 like he was drunk, and before I could even explain a little bit about what happened, he goes, you're just jealous.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Like, you don't even know what happened. He's like, stop being such a woman. It's like, can you actually say that to me? Like, but it's like continuously things like this. Like, how do you deal with it in your own mind? Like, if you're not going to say something, I don't want to say something every time. I'm just going to be like tired. Like, how do you deal with it internally? Like, oh, that person, like, people that you love, men that you love, saying these things. How do you think about it? Like, they're a good person, yet they just have no idea how much that hurts you.
That's such a difficult question. I think maybe if you don't feel able to challenge it every time, it might be worth kind of keeping a note or keeping a kind of running idea in your head, and then maybe having a specific time when you do sit down with them and explain how much it hurts you and explain why it hurts you and why you've had that experience. We've heard from girls who were at university and they lived in a house with guys who they said, just like you have, they're good guys, they don't mean it, they just don't really get it. And one night they sat down with them and they said, actually, here are the 5 things that have happened in our lives to each one of us, really quite serious things that you have probably never experienced, never even had to think about. That's why it upsets us, actually, when you make that joke. That's why it's not funny. That's not why it's not funny when you use the word rape in this particular way, whatever it was. And actually associating the person that they knew and loved with those experiences really shocked those guys, and they stopped doing it. But they needed to understand it, and they needed it to be explained to them. It's so difficult. I'm sorry not to be able to give you a more concrete and better answer, but actually, if it's your boyfriend and if he loves you, then he shouldn't be being sexist to you.
It's not my boyfriend, it's just like my best friend's boyfriend.
Yeah.
He's a good person, he's a smart person, but he will say to me, racial sexism doesn't exist. And then we just get in a massive fight, and it's like, I can't believe you're saying this to me.
Well, sometimes pointing people to the website has been really helpful. We've had a lot of people who said, like, when they say sexism doesn't exist, that's exactly why that's the whole point of the whole thing. So maybe try that. And also, no, your boss can't say that to you. It's against the law. Maybe just tell him. Maybe just tell him it's against the law. You know, let him know that you know. Yeah.
Your web-based project is run by volunteers.
Yeah.
Sorry, two questions. Can you tell us how we can support that? And secondly, can you tell us a little bit about T-shirts?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, the website, the kind of Twitter entries that come in, and all of the different country versions, as well as the moderation, is all run by volunteers. So if anybody's interested in volunteering, please feel free to send me an email. The email address is on the website. And yes, I'm supporting the No More Page 3 campaign, which probably all of you have heard of. I think it's possibly one of the best examples of that phenomenon I was just talking about, of how people can't be isolated anymore by people sort of saying that they're bitter and jealous and trying to kind of put them out on their own. That's what happened to Claire Short when she tried to stand up to Page 3 in the 80s. The Sun basically just ripped her down by isolating her. They said that she was bitter. They said that she was jealous. They attacked her personally. But today, nearly, I think actually any day now, 200,000 signatures on the No More Page 3 petition. And when that many people stand up to something together, it becomes impossible to use those kind of defences. It's not against glamour modelling, it's not against kind of sex, it's just about saying that that picture doesn't belong in a newspaper, in the context of a newspaper. It's one of our biggest family newspapers in the country, it's open on the tube, it's open in GP surgeries. You're all nodding, I don't need to tell you this, you're probably all on board anyway, but yeah, so go forth and support No More Page 3. Yeah?
Just something that I find important, it's not really a question, but that I find important in the discussion that was had before,
Yeah.
is that even lovely, kind, empathetic men, everyone has men that they love, even them, they were privileged from the things that we were talking about. So I think men do get quite defensive, and even when we know it's not their personal fault, and that they would never do things like this, they would never act that way towards women. But still, like, kind men in an office who would never rate women out of 10, they benefit from other men doing that, and women not being hired because they're maternity risk. Men who are lovely and don't think of themselves as sexist, they also benefit from that. So I think the important thing is not so much trying to distance yourself, saying, well, I wouldn't do that, so it's okay, I'm on your side. It's more also accepting the responsibility of that privilege, and when you have to recognise it, and kind of shouldering that responsibility and understanding that because they won't ever have to experience those things, that's a huge privilege, and they can't just say, well, I'm on your side, so it's okay. They also have to understand that they're benefiting from it, and that's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think a really good thing to say about men is that you can't be in the middle ground. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. Because if you want to say that, I wouldn't do it, well, then you have to be actively doing something to counter it. I think that's a fair position to take, certainly. Yeah.
Apart from sort of challenging like men in our lives and sort of raising awareness, what other things on a grander scheme can we do to sort of help?
Well, it is really difficult. There's huge amounts of stuff that you can do more widely in terms of supporting women's organisations in your area, supporting services like Rape Crisis that have been badly hit by the cuts, and Refuge and those kinds of places. I think it's about the fact that this is so normalised in our daily lives that first of all we're all just so used to it, but second of all that we don't even kind of notice it when it happens and that people think it's okay. So as hard as it is, if I could ask everyone one thing, it would absolutely be about making those changes, those challenges when it does come up. And it's so many different things. It's the young people in your lives, it's the girls in your lives being told how pretty they look and the boys being told how big and strong they are. It's the girls being bought play kitchens and the boys are bought the chemistry sets that say boys only. It's definitely about stuff that happens around you, not just when it happens to you, but stepping in when you see street harassment happening, stepping in when you see workplace discrimination happening, and trying to create that sense of kind of a cultural shift away from what we consider to be normalised and acceptable. I think that's probably all we've got time for.
More questions and a lot more conversation to be had, so maybe I could suggest that we'll be around for a little bit longer if you want to come and talk to Laura. But thank you so much for coming. It's really, really great to see so many of you here.
on a Friday